when one of them passes away or for some reason leaves the position, Canada Post has a very difficult time recruiting new rural postmasters to fill those spots. Thinking about postal banking, is that also not a rationale to return to the retail outlet model whereby Canada Post operates a post office that's owned by Canada Post with Canada Post unionized staff that provide services other than postal services, including postal banking and electric vehicle charging, that kind of thing? Do we need to look more at that model for small communities?
Well, definitely, I think we have to look at delivering equal services. And if the model which we have in terms of how the postal outlets are run is putting in danger those services, we have to move to try to correct that. I think that's obviously the case. People have to be able to get the same kinds of equal services, and we have to make sure that postmasters who are running these services are treated equally. We've already seen the terrible crisis that occurred in the UK around this in terms of how some people were treated around the crisis which they had there around that issue. But I think that we can do this and make sure that we are funding adequately the delivery of rural services. And as I said, postal banking can help that because it can bring in additional revenue, which will allow the post office to have the ability to make sure that rural services are delivered in an equal fashion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Brock, and then we'll finish with Mr. Baines.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Anderson, for your attendance and your contribution to this study. I've got essentially a couple of questions. I may not use all my 5 minutes, but I'm going to read all the questions out to you and give you as much time for your response. So I'm curious as to how the post office itself would compete with large Canadian banks across the country that already have the infrastructure, they already have the name recognition, and are well established. That's one question. Would the new postal banking service rely on public funding? If the post office were offering loans while it is losing $750 million a year, what funds would they be relying on to fund those loans? And lastly, how much would it cost to set up the infrastructure required for postal banking?
Well, thank you very much. Excellent questions. Certainly, postal banking around the world has been a situation where the postal banks have competed with traditional private sector banks, and in the case of Canada, it's not just the private sector; it's credit unions, which are, if you take Quebec, I think it's 70% or more of citizens in Quebec use credit unions as their primary banking source. So there would be competition with existing models. But however, I think that competition is justified because banks and credit unions, but particularly banks, have reneged on what the services that they're providing, particularly to rural Canada. They've pulled out. You can just Google any of the big banks and bank branch closures, and you'll see what towns are hit by the closure of banks, banking branches in small town Canada. A huge number on a regular basis, and so I think that. There's first of all, we need to challenge. Excuse me. We need to challenge that, and I think postal banking is one of the ways of offering those kind of services. In the UK, of course, what the system there is that you can use your banking card with another with a bank. With another bank to take out money at the post office. So there's ways of accommodating if you're a member of another bank. But I think that it does offer a service which is, extremely important, and I think we could deliver things. The cost of that, I think, temporarily, in order to get the system running, we would have to borrow a small amount of money, but not huge amounts, because we already have an infrastructure. We don't have to buy buildings. We don't have to hire staff. We've got to train staff and introduce programs slowly as we in terms of services, to make sure the services are accurate and are working well for Canadians who would use them. But I think that is something which is going to be repaid. We've seen in general, in terms of postal banking around the world, that it has been a profitable service. As I said, because many people don't have any other access to banking services, so they would use those postal banking services because they don't have the access to them. And you know, as I said, I mean, right now we've seen another the form that the Canada Post was going to start off was a partnership with TD. They were going to work with TD to deliver some of the financial services through the post office. So there are different ways of doing it, and I think that we can build that situation up where we are able to offer postal banking services in a profitable manner, and I think it's something which does not demand vast amounts of government money in terms of investment to do those things. And we're in a new age, of course, in terms of the internet age, where a lot of these services can be delivered by trained personnel over the internet, and so it's not something where we have to. Well, how are we going to deliver that services? No, we can teach somebody how to deliver a banking service over the internet, and they can have contact with somebody in a central office, etc. And we should be using at the federal level our trained banking experts who are in EDC, the BDC, the Farm Credit Canada, etc.
We have this whole banking infrastructure in Canada, which is very large, at the federal level, owned by the federal government.
So it's not that we don't have anybody who knows what they're doing around banking services. We do.
Thank you. Mr. Baines, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witness for joining us today. And of course, I'd like to recognize our hardworking...
Sorry, Mr. Baines, let me interrupt you for a moment. We're just going to turn up the sound a bit on you. We'll restart your time.
Start again, Mr. Baines, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this good?
No, it's not. Let me move the mic a bit closer.
How about now?
That's a bit better. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you again, and I'll start again. Thank you, Mr. Anderson, for joining us today, and of course recognizing the efforts and dedication of our hardworking Canada Postal workers. I'd like to just touch upon, I think, some parts of you may have touched on before, but I'd like to ask a little bit about the required hardware, software, security, and cybersecurity infrastructure capabilities that you believe that you would be able to meet with respect to having a banking institution set up through Canada Post. If you look at some of the security risks that are associated with the increasing challenges with technology, artificial intelligence, all of these things, we see the protection of people's information that has been compromised in certain corporate companies where people's whether it's like a company like London Drugs here in British Columbia that was compromised. So there's been some recent concerns around that. What are your capabilities that you think that you'll be able to make sure that those risks are mitigated?
Well, first of all, I would say that already Canada Post offices do handle money, handle cash, give out postal money orders, etc., on a regular basis, and some of them do a lot of work in terms of that part of the business. They were moving towards offering loans through the post office, and they had developed certain mechanisms there. I think we can easily rely on our federal banking infrastructure. As I said, the BDC, EDC, Farm Credit Canada, which have expertise in this kind of software that is needed to develop loan programs and the equivalent of mortgage programs, etc. So I think that we have that expertise, and we can employ the latest kind of technologies that are needed around those issues. That is not something which we have no experience in at the federal level.
So you feel that you're confident with tapping into the existing safety measures, whether it's cybersecurity, to the federal, whatever federal programs or technology is available to easily transition into this with this sector, with what your services would be.
Well, we'd have to go after the particular measures which are needed in terms of financial transactions. So that is a particular area of cybersecurity. And as I said, we have expertise in that level at the federal government level. But as I said, this is something which is, postal banking is done in many countries around the world. So they have succeeded in doing this, and they have not had major issues around. There's not been any particular issues in terms of postal banking that hasn't been found anywhere else. And we've seen every so often there's some issue in terms of private sector banks, but in general, private sector banks are capable of doing this, and so should so should the post office be able to do that.
Can you maybe shed light on some of the maybe research you've done and explain like the mixed success of postal banking internationally? What models have been very successful, and where have they maybe been introduced and then led to privatization?
Well, as I said, most European countries have, if you want to start there, have successful postal banking institutions. Some fairly recently, others for a longer time. Some do not, but the majority do. And of course, we've got major countries such as Japan, China as well, which have big postal banking institutions. And Japan is one of the largest banks, is Postal Bank. Certainly, those companies have been developed using postal staff, retraining them, adding new people where necessary. And I think that it is something which the track record in general is very good. As I mentioned, if some of the banks, the Japan
Postal Bank. We really learned anything that systemically will change what's taking place. And that's what we really need. Because if not, we'll be spending another day in the House of Commons here talking about another strategy or another scandal or another type of a problem related to a practice that functionally we haven't changed. And one of the things I do want to talk about is the accountability of government information and contracting that could be different, that is actually different in other industrialized nations. And we wouldn't even be here dealing with that, and that's Crown copyright. So Crown copyright, Madam Speaker, in this country is done different than any other place. And Crown copyright is the availability of the public to see documents, studies, and information that is done in-house. Now, both the Liberals now and the Conservatives have opposed reforming Crown copyright from the early 1900s. I think our law is in place since 1926. And it's different than the United States, it's different than the UK, it's different than everybody else across the board. And why is that important? Because if it was done in-house, if it was done by the public servants, it was done by taxpayers, New Democrats believe that information, those studies, those accountability documents that were being sought after now and other things would be public information. And under the best circumstances, when you contract those information pieces, and you get them done, they're very helpful for businesses, they're very helpful for academics, they're very helpful for a number of different things for our economy and accountability. And you wouldn't have to spend time in the House of Commons debating that because it would already be available. That's what the United States does. That's what they have done since the 1800s. But in Canada, we have a system in place right now that is protected by sensitive so-called information by the government, where you cannot see when the Liberals or Conservatives do those types of studies from public servants. And you know why? Because some of that information that the Conservatives and Liberals have done over the past have been polls, research opinions, and other types of information where their political parties should pay for, but taxpayers have actually paid for that to guide their principles and their things. And if you can't, if you can't get your head around this in terms of why is it that you would, as a taxpayer, pay for all those different things and never get access for it, it's because of the power interests that have taken place here. And that needs to be changed significantly. And if we did this material, and if we did these studies that CGS GC Strategies did, that would be automatically available to the public. So today's discussion, to get the documents, to get the contracts, to actually, it's been through a committee, and it's also, we're actually the Auditor General now to actually deal with these issues, would all be readily available anyways.